The big idea this week is pretty simple. There are coaching changes every year in the NFL. Every year we look at the rosters, there's turnover, we see new players, new systems, and a lot of that information sort of goes over our head, right? We hear that a new offensive coach is coming in. He's going to change the culture. He's going to change the way an offense is run. He's going to put players into a better position than they were in last year. But what does that really mean? This week's big idea is schemes and the way that offenses are schemed and defenses are schemed impact the way that we bet on football in ways that are not immediately apparent. So what do I mean when I'm talking about schemes here? So let's say Matt Eberflus, the new coach of the Bears. He runs a 4-3 defensive scheme, which employs 4 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, 1 Mike, which is the middle linebacker, 1 Sam, strong side, and 1 Will on the weak side. Similarly, Mike McDaniels, the new Dolphins coach, he runs a zone blocking offense. It's like a power zone offense that is reticent of the Mike Shanahan, the Kyle Shanahan offense that has sort of dominated the league over the last 20 or so years. Famously, Mike Shanahan was the Denver Broncos coach who sort of revolutionized the running offense by introducing this zone blocking concept, which was notably different and markedly different from the gap blocking concepts that had dominated football to that point. So now Matt Eberflus and Mike McDaniels are running those sort of base schemes, a power zone and a 4-3 defense, right? But within those schemes, they're going to have their own unique flourishes that sort of make their scheme stand out. So, for example, Sean McVay is another power zone coach, but he does not run the same offense that Kyle Shanahan does. He has his own flourishes, where Kyle Shanahan employs a lot of tight ends, tight formations, and sort of power running. Sean McVay has taken those same concepts and used 11 personnel, meaning there's 3 wide receivers on the field, and a lot of movement to open up those lanes. And sort of each of these coaches has sort of iterized this zone blocking concept and added their own flourishes. So what I think is the most difficult part of assessing a new coach coming in is we don't really know when they first come in how they are going to iterize whatever system they're coming from. So typically a lot of these coaches come from systems that have been around for a long time. They intern places. They served as quality control coach places. They served as an offensive coordinator places. And until we actually see these guys calling plays, we don't know how that's going to manifest itself, okay? So, for example, Kevin O'Connell is a coach we're going to talk about today, and so is Mike McDaniels. Each of those guys they're from the Sean McVay tree, right? But when they get an offense of their own, they're in all likelihood going to try to bring some of the things they learned from other stops. A lot of these coaches that are coming in this year just happen to be from that Kyle Shanahan / Sean McVay tree. And part of that is there's no coincidence there. Everyone knows, anyone who's been following the league has looked around the league and seen that the best role in football right now is to be standing next to Sean McVay, because they hired Sean McVay's quarterback coach to be the head coach of the Bengals a few years ago, and that guy went to the Super Bowl. So at this point, all these NFL teams are basically salivating over the thought of getting their own one of these Sean McVay acolytes or Kyle Shanahan acolytes, because these offenses have just done so well and they've gotten to the Super Bowl. Last year, we finally saw one of these offenses win a Super Bowl in this sort of modern era. So the challenge in sort of forecasting how some of these offenses will actually work, how some of these new coaches will run their teams, is that it's sort of a guessing game, right? Because while a coach may have most recently worked under a Sean McVay or a coach who runs a particular type of scheme, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is how they envision their own offense, right? So, for example, and we'll talk about this with Josh McDaniels, the last couple of years has run this sort of power running team, ball control, bottom of the league, near the bottom in pass attempts, and how much of that has been protecting his quarterbacks over the last 2 years? How much of that has been situation? When you look back at Josh McDaniels when he was a head coach, you see a guy who really prioritized throwing the football. He's a guy who really wanted to be near the top of the league in pass attempts, even when he had a guy like Kyle Orton at quarterback. Why am I telling all of you this? And the reason is pretty simple. It's hugely important when it comes to betting on football. Far too often, we kind of get caught up in the narratives of player versus player, corner versus receiver, quarterback versus quarterback, where the signal callers, the guys who are scheming up these games, are the most important factors in how a lot of these games play out in terms of yards from scrimmage, whether a running back is hitting their player prop, whether a receiver is getting a lot of volume, whether a team's playing with a high pace or they're playing with a more ball control tactic, that is determined on a schematic level. And a lot of times that is in reaction to a coach's scheme or just sort of an ideology that permeates through an offense. So Adam Gase was famously an offensive guru before everyone saw that he was not that at all. But one thing that stood out to me when I was looking at Adam Gase when he took over the Jets was that with the Dolphins, he was constantly, repeatedly near the bottom of the league in plays called per game. And that was a schematic thing. I think that he was not trying to play with a lot of pace. And when he came to the Jets, I think that was something that really manifested itself, because a lot of times, especially if you're looking at player prop totals for a season, if you have a player on offense who is on a team that is not seeing a lot of volume play-wise, that's not a good feeling, because just the math there, the arithmetic is they're not going to have the number of opportunities necessary to hit a lot of their props, right? So let's take a look at last year's Chargers team, right? Just to sort of illustrate this point. They were coached by first-year coach Brandon Staley. This was a team that could not stop the run to save their life. They were ranked near the bottom of the league in basically every run category the entire season. But what I think gets glossed over a lot in that discussion of that Chargers defensive team and that defensive inefficiency was that this inefficiency against the run was a product of Brandon Staley's system. It wasn't necessarily a design flaw. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, because who wants to be ranked near the bottom of the league defensively? But you have to actually look into the schematics, the scheme principles of what he's running to understand that this was a team that was purposely siphoning the run, allowing teams in early downs and encouraging them to run the ball early. So in knowing that, you can take that into your gambling, right? You can look at a game and say, hey, if all things go according to plan for this Brandon Staley Chargers defense, the other team's going to be running a lot on early downs, right? So you could see volume from the running back, the opposing running back. You could also say, I don't know how this may affect the over in this game. Whether it could be a game where it's a ball control game where the other team is running the ball consistently and the time is ticking. And if you're looking at a particularly high over-under, it could be something that you take into effect, right? Take into account. So Brandon Staley, as I mentioned before, he comes from this sort of 3-4 shell too high schematic background, right? He worked under Vic Fangio, former coach of the Broncos, former defensive coordinator with the Bears. And without getting too into the weeds on this, what I was referencing before is that part of the shell too high concept that Vic Fangio sort of really innovated with over the last several years is that, and Staley sort of iterated on when he came to the Rams in 2020 as a defensive coordinator and then took that to the Chargers, is the idea of presenting defenses or offenses with light boxes, meaning that there are less linebackers, less defensive backs in the tackle box, meaning that if you're on offense and you see there's less linebackers in the box, you're more inclined to run the ball because there are more guys dropping back. You're sort of cutting off the deep pass. You're forcing teams. You're sort of dictating the terms of the next play just by saying, hey, if you guys want to run the ball, it's all you. And part of that reasoning is because a lot of the advanced metrics, a lot of these statistics indicate that this is an advantageous position for the defense to be in because they can dictate the terms of how the next play is going to go. So Brandon Staley, he opted to pursue this shell too high light box approach throughout the year, and we saw at various points how well this could work, right? Just look at the box score from the Chargers' early season win against the Chiefs. 100 yards rushing for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 45 yards rushing for Mahomes, only 260 yards passing for Mahomes, and 2 interceptions. All this leads to a Chargers victory, right? So now this is a direct result of scheming. The Chiefs fell into the Chargers' defensive trappings and began shifting away from their areas of strength, which is deep passes, taking the top off, and they weren't taking advantage of these underneath routes that they sort of figured out as the year progressed. They were simply sort of flummoxed by this Chargers defense because they were buying into this scheme, right? Now fast forward 3 months, December 16th, 2021. The Chiefs ultimately end up beating the Chargers in the rematch, overtime game. The Chiefs total more than 500 total yards, over 400 yards passing, over 86 yards on the ground. The difference here is that the Chiefs adjusted to the schematic trappings of the Chargers defense, and they reaped the benefits here. So they were not inclined to run the ball just because the Chargers were giving it to them. They looked at how the Chargers sort of set up that defense, how they were dictating the terms, and they did not fall into those trappings. And when you're betting on football, you have to acknowledge that some of these schemes are really a determining factor in how these game progresses, right? But why does all this matter? Simply put, it's because knowledge is power when it comes to betting on football, right? So through assessing the schematic history of an incoming head coach, we can attempt to gain some sort of advantage over the books in projecting how players and how the team will benefit from their schematic additions or iterations from where they came from.